Tonight we continue our study in the book of Esther, and we're going to focus on chapter 3, verse 12 through chapter 4, verse 8. Esther is a fantastic story. Esther is going to be the heroine of the story, and perhaps the most fascinating thing about the book is that God is not mentioned by name, not even once. In fact, we're going to run into some passages tonight when we expect God's name to be mentioned. We would expect prayer to be mentioned, but it's not. It's left out. And that kind of is confusing to us. In fact, we sometimes want to read that back into the story, but it's a fantastic story. God's not mentioned, but yet God is working behind the scenes. And God is working out the circumstances, even though people may not realize it at the time. Well, the story begins with a banquet. Banquets are very important in this book. In fact, if you follow the banquets, you could follow the storyline of this book. King Xerxes gives a great banquet to raise support for his military efforts, and he invites Vashti into his banquet, and Vashti decides she's not going into that room. She's not going to be part of that banquet, and that creates a crisis that's critical for the book because Vashti is deposed as the queen, and the need now is for a new queen. And of course, that gives Esther an opportunity to step into the story. In fact, the second section, which we'll finish tonight, involves three main characters, Esther, Mordecai, and Haman. And all three of those characters have a story that the author wants to share with us. Esther's story is she becomes the new queen. She pleases the king the most of all of the candidates, and King Xerxes chooses her as the queen. So Esther is now in a place of influence in the Persian Empire. The story of Mordecai. Mordecai has a great job. He works for King Xerxes, and he has a high-level position. And one day, Mordecai finds out there's a couple of individuals who want to assassinate the king. Mordecai finds out about it, tells Queen Esther about it. Queen Esther tells King Xerxes, and the plot is foiled. And we would expect that Mordecai would receive great honor from the king because Mordecai saves the king's life. But apparently the king either forgets about it, gets distracted because there's no reward ceremony, there's no honor or respect or loyalty paid to Mordecai. In fact, at that very moment when we would expect Mordecai to be honored, somebody else gets honored. His name is Haman. And we're not even told why he gets honored. I mean, what could be greater than saving the king's life? Whatever Haman did, it can't be any greater than that. But yet Haman, not Mordecai, is honored. So that creates a twist in the story, especially when we find out who Haman is. He's an Agagite. He's an Amalekite. And looking back over the Old Testament, the Israelites and the Amalekites have been fighting for over 1,000 years. Joshua defeated the Amalekites when the children of Israel were in the wilderness. King Saul, the first king of Israel, defeats the Amalekites, and King Agag, and Haman comes from that family line. He's an Agagite. So throughout the history of the Jewish people, they've done well against the Amalekites. Well, Haman is honored, and the king issues a decree that everyone bows before Haman. Everybody shows honor and respect to Haman, and everybody does, except Mordecai. We're not told why Mordecai doesn't. It could have something to do with the fact that he's a Jewish man, and Haman is an Amalekite. And Lord forbid that I should bow before my enemy. So Mordecai refuses to bow. Eventually, somebody tells Haman that there's this guy named Mordecai who's not giving you the respect that the king commanded. Haman finds out about Mordecai and also finds out that Mordecai is Jewish. Well, Haman had probably grown up hearing all the stories of all the times the Jewish people defeated his people. And now Haman's thinking, I can get even. I can get one up here. I have a higher position in the Persian Empire than Mordecai does. So I can use my position not only to punish Mordecai, but to punish all the Jewish people. So Haman has this crazy idea to go before King Xerxes and to get the king to sign off on an edict that all the Jewish people would be put to death on a certain calendar date. And for some crazy reason, Xerxes lets Haman do whatever he wants to do. Maybe part of it is Haman promises a lot of money to go into the royal treasury. Because not only will the Jews be killed, but all their stuff will be taken, all their coins will be gathered, and this large deposit can be made in the royal treasury. Because, King Xerxes kind of depleted the funds when he lost the war to the Greeks. So this would be an opportunity to restore those funds. It's interesting as the author tells the story, that King Xerxes never asked Haman the question, what people group are you talking about? What have they done? And why don't you like them? It's amazing as the author tells the story that King Xerxes simply hands over the signet ring to Haman and says, do whatever you want. And that's an open invitation for Haman to do whatever he wants. So Haman draws up a decree that the Jewish people, all the Jewish people, throughout the entire Persian Empire, would be put to death on a certain date. And this decree will go out, signed and with the signet ring of King Xerxes. So it has all the authority of the Persian Empire. It has the king's stamp of approval, and it's irrevocable once it goes into law. And that's where we left off the last time. So we're going to pick up tonight with Haman's edict being published, being spread throughout the Persian Empire. So let me read Esther chapter 3, verses 12 through 15. Then we'll talk about those verses. It says, beginning in verse 12, then on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out in the script of each province and in the language of each people all Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors, and the various provinces and the nobles of the various peoples. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so that they would be ready for that day. The couriers went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. Well, let's take a look at what goes on once this edict is finally going to be published. And to get this published, you have to summon the royal secretaries. Now, this particular edict is going out to every province, all 127 of them. And there are many languages spoken throughout the Persian Empire. So, in a particular province, you may have 2 or 3 different languages that are spoken, so it has to be written out in each of those languages. Now, today, if you want to make 127 copies of something, it's a piece of cake. You put it in the Xerox machine, you type in 127, hit start, and within a couple of minutes you have 127 copies. But this is the ancient world. They all have to be written by hand. So there's at least 127 of these messages, maybe more, because of different languages. So these royal secretaries have their work cut out for them on that day. It's their job to make sure that this edict goes out and is printed and sealed in all 127 provinces. And this particular edict will arrive to the king's officials, the satraps, the governors, and the nobles, and then it will be spread to all the people. So Haman is making sure that everybody in the Persian Empire is going to know about this. And everyone in the Persian Empire will be on board with what he wants to do. So, it's also interesting that all of these were written in the name of King Xerxes. Now, Xerxes did not draft this particular edict. Haman did. But Xerxes hands to Haman his signet ring. So Haman's able to write whatever he wants to write, stamp it with the king's signet ring, and it reads as if it's coming from King Xerxes. So when this finally arrives, nobody's going to know that Haman wrote it. Everybody's going to think, well, this is coming from the king. It's got his signet ring stamped right there. Well, they decide that this is going to take place on the 13th day of the first month. This particular date is ironic and a little, it has great significance. Well, for the Babylonians and the Persians, 13 is an unlucky number. I think that tradition has been carried down to our own culture, and we often think of number 13 as being unlucky. There's even some elevators that go from floor 12 to floor 14, skipping number 13, because it supposedly is unlucky. But it goes all the way back to the Babylonians and the Persians. But yet, this edict is drafted on the 13th day of the month. Then it would be sent out on day 14. And the 14th day of the first month, if you're Jewish, is the beginning of Passover. So imagine yourself as a Jewish person living in the Persian Empire. It's the 14th day of the first month. It's Passover. This is the day to celebrate what God did for Israel, for their ancestors, getting them safely out of slavery in Egypt and on to the land of freedom. It's a day to celebrate God's deliverance. But in the middle of that celebration, you find out there's an edict by King Xerxes that 11 months from now, all the Jewish people will be put to death. So, you're celebrating God's deliverance in the past and reading about your death in the future. Talk about a good way to put a damper on a celebration. You know, how can I celebrate when I'm going to die 11 months from now? Will God really let that happen? I mean, did God deliver our ancestors so many years ago from the Egyptians to now we're all going to die by the hands of the Persians? Is that really going to happen? I'm sure the Jewish people had that very question when they read that edict that had gone out. Verse 13 talks about several things. The first is the fact that this is going to take place on the 13th day of the 12th month, which means there's 11 months to go. So this isn't going to happen tomorrow or next week or even next month. The destruction of the Jewish people will take place 11 months after this edict is issued. So the Jewish people at least have some time. 11 months is at least time to make some kind of a response. Now, it's also true that this edict is all-inclusive. It goes on to say that this edict goes to all the king's provinces, all 127 of them. So it's not that the Jewish people can run and hide somewhere. This is going to be true throughout the Persian Empire. And it also includes all the Jews. Yes, men, women, and children. If you're Jewish, you're to die on that day. And this is talking about a total slaughter of the Jewish people. Notice the words that are used: destroy, kill, and annihilate. Sounds like the words of an angry man. And they are, because Haman wrote it. Xerxes did not write those words. Those words come from Haman, who's looking for an opportunity to get even with the Jewish people for what their ancestors have done to his ancestors. So now he wants to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jewish people. And not only that, you have to plunder their goods, because Haman's made a promise to Xerxes that he's going to supply 10,000 talents of silver into the treasury of the king. That's the edict that goes out. And then in verse 14, this gets repeated, that it goes to every province and every nationality. So if you're living in the Persian Empire and you're not Jewish, it's your responsibility to get rid of all the Jews on the 13th day of the 12th month. So this slaughter will take place in a single day throughout the Persian Empire. The couriers go out, and the edict is issued from Susa. Now, according to Herodotus, it's going to take about 3 months for this edict to travel throughout the entire Persian Empire. Now, the Persians had a great postal system for 400 BC. They didn't have Facebook, Instagram, any of those things. Today, you can get something done in 4 seconds. It would take 3 months before everyone in the Persian Empire knows about this. So, after the 3 months, there's still 8 months left before this is to take place. Then the story concludes with a contrast. The king and Haman sat down to drink. Now, banquets are very important in this book, and this is a banquet on a small scale. Xerxes and Haman sat down to have a nice dinner and a few glasses of wine. They're celebrating their great success. But in contrast to all of that, the city of Susa is bewildered. It's like, where did this come from? What did the Jewish people do to deserve this? Why would the king want to kill off the Jewish people? I know some Jewish people, they're nice people. Why would the king do this? And if the king would do this now to the Jewish people, who might he do it to later? Will the next time be my people who will be annihilated? Everybody is bewildered. This doesn't make sense. This is crazy. Why would the king ever issue such an edict? And so the chapter closes. It's interesting. Chapter 2 closes with Mordecai saving King Xerxes' life. He foiled the assassination attempt. Chapter 3 closes with Xerxes, through Haman, issuing an edict that will mean the death of Mordecai and all his fellow Jewish people. Oh, what a difference a chapter makes. Mordecai does something great for the king, and the king turns around and does this to Mordecai and his people. And so the chapter ends. We come to the next main part of the story, and I've entitled it Esther's Courageous Decision. This is the central part of the story. Now that the edict has gone out, what's going to happen? How do you turn this around? How do you survive this? What can the Jewish people possibly do? Well, in this section, we read about Mordecai's pain. Mordecai finds out about this. He's one of the king's officials. He probably was one of the first to find out about it. And he's in great emotional pain, perhaps realizing, I'm really the cause of this. I mean, if I would have bowed down to Haman, none of this would have ever happened. Mordecai is also not someone to just say, we're done. We've got 11 months. He comes up with a plan in verses 4 through 17. And the most interesting part of the plan is, it's really not about him. It's about Esther. Because according to Mordecai's thinking, the only hope of the Jewish people is what Esther can do in persuading the king. It all boils down to her. And that's his plan. And then finally, Esther's petition. What will she say? Will she carry out a plan? Will she try to go before the king? Will she try to rescue her own people? Now, that's not an easy thing to do. And the stakes are really high. We already know that Vashti has been deposed. Will Esther be the next queen to be deposed? Will she take her life in her own hands by going before the king and asking him to do something about an edict that he's already signed off on? There are tough choices that lie ahead. If you've ever had to make a tough choice, you're going to be able to identify with what Esther in the choice that she's going to have to make. All the pros and all the cons. And what do I do next? Well, it all begins with Mordecai's pain in verses 1 through 3. But let me read verses 1 through 8. That's as far as we're going to get tonight. Then we'll come back and talk about those verses. So chapter 4 begins where chapter 3 leaves off. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hatak, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hatak went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence, to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. So now it gets really interesting. Mordecai's pain. Chapter 3 concludes with Haman and Xerxes having a little party, a banquet, great food and having a few drinks together. The people in the city are scared to death, bewildered at what's going to happen. And now we find Mordecai in great sorrow. Another contrast. Haman is celebrating and Mordecai is in sorrow. And it begins in verse 1. Mordecai finds out about the edict. And it causes him great emotional pain. He figures out pretty quickly, this is all about him. He wouldn't bow before Haman. And so Haman issues this edict against all the Jewish people. But it's interesting that Mordecai, at least according to the text, never has the thought, I messed up. I should have shown respect and honor to Haman. In fact, if I would have just bowed before Haman, none of this would have happened. I'm to blame for this. He never really says that. Now, Mordecai's in great distress because his fellow Jews are going to die. But he doesn't really have any regret about how he treated Haman. That doesn't really enter the picture. Mordecai is going to show grief the way an ancient person would express grief. Now, the question that we immediately are encountered with is, does this grief show repentance, prayer, a petition to God, a calling out to God, a turning to God, a surrender to God? Or is it simply an expression of how a common person would express grief? Well, it begins with Mordecai tearing his clothes. And tearing your clothes back in the ancient world was an expression of grief. If you are given bad news, one of the first responses is to tear your clothes. It's an expression of grief. And throughout the Old Testament, there are many instances of people tearing their clothes. However, pagan people who did not worship the God of heaven, would do the same thing. When they received bad news, they would likewise tear their clothes. In fact, Herodotus tells the story of the Persians. When they find out that King Xerxes loses to the Greeks at Salamis, the Battle of Salamis goes to the Greeks, not the Persians. They tear their clothes. So Mordecai tears his clothes. It's an expression of grief. The second thing he does, he puts on sackcloth and ashes. And this is used many times in the Old Testament as well. Sackcloth was made of goat's hair, and it was a garment that was very scratchy, very itchy, not a pleasant thing to wear. And you would wear it to show that you were in grief or expressing mourning, normally for someone who had died. And the ashes you would sprinkle on top of your head. Again, showing grief, showing mourning for someone who had died. Now, according to the edict, the Jewish people are not going to die for 11 months. But Mordecai has already concluded that they're all going to die. And he's already mourning the loss of all the Jewish people, even before it happens. So in Mordecai's mind, it's time for a funeral service for all the Jewish people. Then he runs through the streets, wailing loudly and bitterly. And we read this as Westerners and go, what's up with him? Why would he ever do that? Well, in ancient culture, especially in the Orient, expressing your emotions was part of what you did. Somehow we've been taught to suppress our emotions. But back in those days, people would just yell and scream and let everybody know what's going on. They would wear their heart on their sleeve and yell it out for everybody to know. It's interesting what it doesn't say in verse 1. It doesn't say that Mordecai prayed. In fact, if you read the book of Nehemiah, also written during the time of the Persian Empire, when Nehemiah hears about the condition of the walls in Jerusalem, he does similar things. But then he prays. In fact, his prayer is recorded in Nehemiah chapter 1. Mordecai goes through all these external things, but there's no evidence that he actually prays. Now, a lot of commentators want to read into this that Mordecai is a very spiritual man, and he really did pray, and he really did turn to God, and he really did repent on behalf of his people. But the text doesn't say that. I mean, we want Mordecai to do that because by now we're fans of Mordecai. And we want Mordecai to survive, and we want Mordecai to do well. So we read into the story such that Mordecai comes off looking really good. But there's no evidence of that. Which raises this question. When you receive bad news, how do you respond? I'm guessing that you don't tear your clothes, you don't put on sackcloth and ashes, and you don't go about wailing loudly and bitterly. Because we just don't do that in the modern world. But sometimes we get depressed, and we lock ourselves in our house, and we don't come out, we don't answer the phone, we don't answer texts. But at what point do we pray? At what point do we turn the matter over to God? At what point do we trust God with the bad news? Maybe what we do is no better than what Mordecai did, if we don't actually turn to God and trust Him. Well, Mordecai knows the law. He knows wearing sackcloth, he can't enter into the king's gate. So he has to stay outside, because nobody wearing that kind of clothing could enter into the king's gate. Perhaps it protects the dignity of the king. Perhaps it's just such that the king doesn't want that kind of clothing and that kind of grief in his gate and in his court. Not really told why, but it was a Persian law. And it's interesting that Mordecai is accused of breaking Persian law, but even in his grief, he keeps the law. He's not willing to go into the king's gate. Now this edict gets spread throughout the empire. So now Jewish people all over the empire get the edict, and they read it, and they respond with great mourning, and with fasting, and weeping, and wailing, and sackcloth, and ashes. But again, there's not a single reference to prayer. There's not a single reference that these people surrender and turn to God. We hope that they did. We wish that they would. But there's no evidence that they do. Mordecai's plan in verses 4 through 17. And in these verses, Mordecai and Esther are going to have a conversation. But the conversation never takes place face to face. They send messages back and forth. And the eunuch Hatak relays most of the messages. That's how the messages are sent. But it's interesting that they never get together for a face-to-face conversation, even though there are 3 stages to their conversation. The first is Esther's going to send some clothes to Mordecai, but Mordecai refuses them. Then Esther decides to send Hatak to go find Mordecai and find out what in the world is going on with him. And Hatak does, and Mordecai gives him an earful. In fact, he spills his guts about everything that's taking place. And then Mordecai says to Hatak in the third part of this, "Go back and tell Esther that the only hope for the Jewish people is for her to go before the king and plead for mercy." Well, that's risky. Doesn't Mordecai know that it's risky to go before the king uninvited? Will Esther actually do such a thing? Well, let's find out as the story goes on. It begins with Esther's concern, and her concern is for Mordecai. And the most interesting thing about this is, Esther doesn't seem to know anything about the edict. And she's the queen. And she's living there in the citadel of Susa where the edict is issued. But she knows nothing about it, which is a good indication that the king never discusses official business with the queen. She's not part of that. In fact, at this point, she doesn't even know about it. But Esther, as the queen, has eunuchs, men who are her servants. She also has some females who are her servants. And they come and tell her that there's something crazy going on with Mordecai. Now, apparently, all of these servants know that there's some connection between Mordecai and Esther. Maybe they know that they're cousins. Maybe they know that Mordecai adopted Esther when she was a child and raised her as his own. Maybe they know that. So they know there's a connection. And so they come and tell Esther, Mordecai's acting crazy. He's wearing sackcloth and he's yelling at the top of his lungs, and we don't even know what he's talking about. And because of that, Esther is in great distress. In fact, it says she's greatly writhing in pain, emotional pain, because of this. And it's important to remember that relationship between Mordecai and Esther. I mean, Esther looks at Mordecai as her father. In fact, up to this point in the story, everything that Mordecai tells Esther to do, she does immediately. She respects this man who raised her. It's her dad. It's her father. And now that he's going crazy, that causes her great emotional distress. So she has this idea to send him some clothes, thinking, if Mordecai puts on regular clothes, he can go through the king's gate, and Mordecai knows where Esther lives. That's not a secret to him. And Mordecai can make his way to Esther, and they can have a conversation. Makes perfect sense. Except for the fact that Mordecai refuses the clothes. And it's interesting in this story, in this dialogue, that Mordecai won't put on the clothes, and he won't go in the king's gate so Esther can find him. And at the same time, Esther's not about to go outside the king's gate and go have a conversation with a man who's dressed in sackcloth. That's beneath the dignity of the queen. So, Mordecai won't go to Esther, and Esther won't go to Mordecai. So, Esther's got plan B. She's going to summon Hatak, who is one of the king's eunuchs, and orders him to find out what's troubling Mordecai and why. Apparently, Esther trusts this eunuch named Hatak, because she's going to send him to Mordecai and find out what's going on. So it's okay for Hatak, one of the servants, to go find Mordecai dressed in sackcloth and have a conversation with him. And that conversation takes place in verse 6. And it takes place in the open square, which was the marketplace. And in the marketplace, there were lots of people. And everybody was milling around. Everybody was having conversations. So for Hatak to go out to the marketplace and, there's Mordecai. So he finds Mordecai and goes up and has a conversation with him. Nobody would think anything of that. So it's his responsibility to find out what's going on with Mordecai. But notice it's in front of the king's gate. It's not inside the gate, because Mordecai cannot go inside the gate. Well, Mordecai is in such distress that Mordecai tells Hatak everything. He spills his guts, tells the whole story. Now, it's possible that Mordecai knows who Hatak is. I mean, both of them work for the king. So they've probably been together on social occasions before, and Mordecai may recognize him and know exactly who he is. But yet, Mordecai, in his distress, wants to tell his story. And so he does. And sometimes when people are in distress, they just need to tell their story, which means they need somebody to listen to their story. And Hatak listens to Mordecai's story. And Mordecai is somewhat hung up on the exact amount of money that Haman has promised to the king. So according to Mordecai, the reason King Xerxes accepted Haman's proposal was the fact that it was going to make him a lot of money. So King Xerxes cares more about money than he cares about the Jewish people. In fact, if we read the story as the author presents it, King Xerxes doesn't even know which people group is going to be destroyed, because he never asked the question. He just knows that some people in the empire are going to die, but I'm going to get rich in the process. And apparently that was his motivation to say, sure, Haman, do whatever you want to do. Then in verse 8, Mordecai tells Hatak, I want you to tell Queen Esther two things. The first thing is, here's a copy of the edict. Apparently she hasn't seen it. So here it is, take it to her, let her read it for herself, and if necessary, you can explain it to her. And indeed he can. So the second thing that Mordecai tells Hatak is, I want you to tell Queen Esther to go into the king's presence and beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Remember the beginning of the story when Esther was one of the candidates to be the queen? Mordecai says to Esther, don't tell anybody you're Jewish. And Esther says, okay, I won't tell a soul. Mordecai just told Hatak that Esther's Jewish, because Hatak's going to read the edict. He knows that it's the destruction of the Jewish people that we're talking about. And now Mordecai calls the Jewish people, her people, Esther's people. The cat's out of the bag, so to speak. Now everybody's going to know that Esther is Jewish. There's been a change in plans. Now Mordecai wants Esther to tell everybody that she's Jewish and to defend her Jewish people before the king. To go before the king and let him know that this edict against the Jewish people is going to involve her too. And it's her people who are at stake. And why in the world did you ever let this happen? Well, that sounds like a risky thing to do. Especially in front of King Xerxes. He's already gotten rid of one queen. Esther could be the next queen to go. And if she makes a false move, she may not only lose her position as queen, she could lose her life. This was a very risky thing to do. But according to Mordecai, it's our only hope. It's our last chance, our only chance. So Esther, the ball is now in your court. What are you going to do with it? And next week, we'll find out what Esther does now that the ball is in her court. What we learn tonight is when we get bad news, how do we respond? Do we immediately take it to God? Or do we try to fix it on our own? Or do we just complain about it? Or gripe about it? Prayer. Is it our first response or our last resort? As somebody said, well, we've tried everything else, we might as well pray. What they did and what we do, there's a great lesson there. Let God be your first response. Heavenly Father, thank you for this story. What an incredible story. What a story that's filled with such tension. A story where the stakes are so high. A story where one mistake could ruin everything. And Father, it reminds us of our own lives where we don't know what we're going to face from day to day. And we do know that when we face difficult circumstances or tough choices or we get bad news, that often we're flustered. We don't know what to do. But Father, help us and teach us to turn to you. May you always be our first response. And may our faith in you grow stronger during tough times. May it not grow weaker. May we learn to trust you even though we don't know the outcome in advance. May we trust your will, your plan, your ways above all else. Father, teach us to grow in our faith in that way, I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.